Well, welcome to this very exciting and dynamic panel of panelists who are here today to talk about inclusion and diversity. And we hope to have quite an open discussion. We have a couple of framing questions that I'll ask each to talk about a little bit in turn, with some time for open conversation and reflection among them. And then we hope to save some time also at the end so that you'll be able to offer some input and ask some questions as well. And as I said, I'm very pleased to be able to moderate the discussion because I think this group of panelists brings a very diverse range of experiences, both from academia and from industry, and from other areas that sometimes we don't get an opportunity to talk about, working within recruitment, for example, and working in different markets with different sensitivities to lots of different issues. But I'm going to start with just a brief introduction to each before we start with the conversation that we're going to have. So I'll begin by starting with Kate Edwards, who is sitting here, who's the Executive Director for the Independent Game Developers Association. International Game Developers Association, I'm sorry. And next, for those of us who might have heard earlier, we had David Gaider, who's here from Beamdog Studios, a game developer and a writer, currently creative director for Beamdog, but formerly of BioWare. We also have with us Ellen Beeman, who is a writer and a game designer and a producer, working for Gizmocracy. And she also teaches at the DigiPen Institute of Technology, where she's a senior lecturer. Next to her, we have Karin Ryding, who's from Osmo Games, game producer. What's wrong with me today? Osmo Games, game producer, and also most recently a lecturer here at University of Hoofda. And we have Jenny Brusk, who is also a senior lecturer here at the University of Hoofda, and one of the co-founders of Donna, which is a local, started locally as a forum for which to talk about diversity on a number of different levels, and I hope she'll share some experience from that today. And we also have Souvik Mukherjee from the Presidency University in India, and he works as an assistant professor and deals with a lot of academic issues concerning post-colonialism, interesting narrative strategies for developing. And then we also have Richard Bartle from the University of Essex in the UK, who's a professor and game researcher and writer with lots of interesting experiences, I think, to bring to our conversation today. Okay. So, as I said, we're going to begin with some framing questions, and I thought as a way to help us consider the context from which each of the panelists considers the topic of diversity and inclusion, I would ask them to give about a 2-minute maximum statement wherein they try to define what it actually means to be inclusive and diverse, bringing their own context to bear on that so that we can start to think again on a more kind of personal level, because I think oftentimes, inclusion and diversity become kind of buzzwords, and we want to try to make them more concrete and think about that. So I think we're just going to start with Kate, and we're going to make our way around the panel and let them make their statements, and then we'll have a conversation after that among each of the panelists. Okay, so Kate?
Okay, is this on? Yes, it is. So thank you. I'm very glad to be here. And so inclusion and diversity. So from my perspective, inclusion, I see, especially coming from a U.S. perspective, where diversity, that word has been thrown around for about 20, 30 years now in the corporate environment, where it's something that we have to do. It's something that's important. We talk about diversity in the U.S. quite a bit, and yet you can see in U.S. society it doesn't always play out that well. It doesn't play out very well. In the corporate spaces, though, most companies all have diversity statements and diversity goals and things of that nature, which I think are great. But even, we went through a period in the mid-90s or so where there was a backlash against affirmative action, where there was all these programs to ensure that there was going to be diversity, and yet, there was kind of a both political and social backlash against the idea of actually having quotas and things like that. What's interesting now, though, that I've seen in a lot of companies is that they've more quietly instituted some of their own affirmative action. We've seen it happen in terms of like Intel with their diversity and technology initiative. They launched at CES last year, and they've already shown that within a year they've made massive changes internally at Intel in changing their corporate culture. And part of that was tying executive compensation to diversity numbers in the different divisions at Intel. And it's actually shown progress. There was a story just recently about the president of FX Networks that produces content for the FX cable channel, where he basically made a kind of a dictator-style declaration that we will hire more diverse people to produce and create our programming. And now I believe he said over 50% of all the directors working on their programs are people of color and women. And when they asked him, how did you make that happen? What's your secret? He said, it's just a matter of will. You just do it. When it comes to inclusion, I actually think that we are moving on from the era of, I call it sort of the era of diversity, and more towards the idea of inclusion. And I think inclusion, especially in the creative space, really focuses on as the word says, including absolutely every possible angle to make your content better, because ultimately you want your content to be viewed and enjoyed by as many people as possible. So if that is your goal, which for most creative people, whether it's games or literature or film or whatever it might be, from that angle, you want to make sure that you're accounting for viewpoints that are not necessarily your own or by the group that you're usually associated with. And so that includes, creative inclusion it's not just about gender, it's not just about ethnicity, it's also about age, about looking across all the range of demographics. It's looking about different geographies, different cultures, also different job functions too, or different walks of life. It's not just about strictly gender and ethnicity, as a lot of people think when you think about diversity. So really inclusion in the most broadest sense in order to make your work better and more appealing, and basically just, be open-minded to viewpoints out there that are so divergent from your own, because it will ultimately inform a better outcome for what you're working on. Whether or not you choose to accept the feedback is your creative decision, but you should be open to it.
Thank you. David?
I think in the game dev field, I think for me, when I think about diversity, it's about normalization. You're struggling to get away from the default that's been around forever. You have an industry that started with the vast majority of the teams being made up of white guys, and you have sort of a very frat kind of locker room atmosphere, I guess. And there's just the default that developed of that, it just became sort of automatic, and you don't think about it. It's invisible, and that extends to the players. They consider the default to be invisible as well. When you have a character that's male and white, you don't question that. That doesn't require explanation. But if you include anything else, suddenly it sticks out. And I think for diversity, the eventual goal is to get to the point where that things that aren't the default don't stick out anymore. Because what you hear about when people talk about it, whether it's the online arguments or people get angry at Twitter or whatever, it's always when they get angry, it seems to say more about the person who's being angry. It says more about them than it does about the actual content, because it's like, here's this one character that's different from the others all around it, and they're saying, oh, it jumped at me, it was very glaring, and well, frankly, they say it just got shoved down their throats, but the point is that they noticed it because it was, to them, it seemed so different, and because it was so different, it required extra explanation. And I think that eventually the games industry has to get to the point where this has happened often enough that it just gets normalized, and we don't require those extra explanations anymore. I think that is the end goal.
Thank you. And now Ellen.
Thank you. So when people ask me why do I advocate for diversity in games, and specifically diversity in hiring, I have a really great answer, which is it makes good business sense. So I, for example, I represent the rather large percentage of game buyers who are female and our age is 35 to something. And No need to go into details there. I've been in the game industry for 25 years. But you have to have the talent creating the games that can make, I can say, okay, I can put myself in the head of an 18-year-old male and write games for them, and I did that on the Wing Commander series quite a bit. But how much better is it if you actually have people working on the games that represent these different demographics that you're trying to reach? It really does make a difference. In terms of inclusion, I actually think of it very simply of don't exclude people. Don't do things that push people away, and then by the nature of the game you create, you are inclusive. I will admit there was a watershed moment for me when I first played World of Warcraft, and there was a character who had frizzy hair like mine. And I was like, wow, somebody who actually I can feel like this is my character. It's not hard to do. It just, like Kate was saying, it just takes the will. It just takes the decision, and in many regards, the recognition that yes, this is a good business decision.
Thank you. And Karin?
Yes, well, I've thought about this a bit from a personal perspective then, and the thing is, I've been running my own game company here in Sweden, in Malmö, for 10 years, and it's been an interesting journey, so to say, these 10 years. We started in 2006, and a lot of things have happened, obviously, in the game industry during these 10 years, but we've always felt quite a lot like odd birds, so to say. It's me and my friend Bobby Sand run the company, and she's also a woman, apparently, obviously. And that's quite unusual for women to run game companies in Sweden and in the world. And we always felt like the games that we make, that people are questioning them, are they really games? So, and for me, that doesn't really matter. I'm like, okay, whatever they are. But so I came back to this question for inclusivity. I think we have a need not only to kind of include different kind of people, because obviously we need that, but I also feel like if you bring in people that you don't understand, they make things that you don't understand. So I think we need to kind of go back and somehow redefine what we think games are, not just what we think game developers are or gamers are, but also the games in themselves somehow.
And now I think everything has been said that I was about to say. But I think to start, inclusivity, if you look up that word, it would actually say, I have it here, open to everyone and not limited to certain people. And I think that sort of just tells it all. So for me, it's a lot about democracy, that everyone has access in some way. So it's about creating new types of games for new types of audiences. And like you were saying, sort of expanding the idea of what games are and can be, adding more things to the toolbox, so to say. And also include, so that means we have to include more people. We need diversity in the teams. We need diversity in the game content. We need diversity in also in the audience. So to me, this is also about inclusive game development. That is, you cannot just work with one of those things. You have to think about it the whole way, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense. And I think that democracy is probably one of the biggest, not feeling left out.
Souvik.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be included in this diverse panel on diversity. So I look at games from the point of view of storytelling in video games. And I mean, games present a multiplicity of meanings and interpretations in terms of representation and reception. So my main interest in diversity is actually to talk about the voices that are represented and that are not represented, that are excluded, right? What we keep in, what we keep out. And I mainly look at Orientalist stereotypes in video games and colonial representations. Somehow, although the colonies have gone, I don't know, colonial stereotypes have remained and, persist. And I also want to talk about the fact that even in attempts to represent diversity, there are nevertheless stereotypes at work. in just talking about diversity. I'm going to quote a little bit from somebody, the developer of Age of Empires 3. He says, one other fun detail, I'm not sure why this is fun, you may be aware that for religious reasons, Indians do not consume cows and so forth, and so indeed they do not in the game. Now this is a little problematic because although it is well-intentioned in terms of representing diversity, not all Indians are Hindus, and it raises lots of political issues now. I mean, with the consumption of, with the eating of cows. I mean, and this is actually normative. It's kind of a normative stereotype, which is coming in from a well-intentioned comment. And I can understand, as David said, that you can't really account for everything. But well, research on this would have been welcome. And I'm also a member of DIGRA's diversity working group, and now we're working on organizing a diversity panel at DIGRA. I see the need to have such conversations, and as a researcher in India's game industry, I'm also seeing myself looking at representation of diversity and inclusiveness in terms of gender, which is an issue globally, and also caste, which is not as relevant elsewhere in other discussions. So, yeah, I mean, and I also wrote an article in a newspaper on women game developers, and well, got my round of my fair share of Gamergate criticism as well. So okay.
And Richard.
Okay, so you're going to have to stop me when I start to rant.
I might just encourage you if you start to rant.
Yeah, okay. So I'm the old, white, straight male on the panel. Which are indeed 4 dimensions which do describe me, and because of that, you could imagine that it's because of structural advantages that enables me to sit here, whereas I could have been anything that isn't straight, white, male, or old. And human probably. However, well, the thing is that is indeed there is a structural reason why I'm here. Now, if you're from pretty well anywhere other than England, Scotland and Ireland would probably get it as well, you won't notice something about me. But if you're from the UK, you will. I'm a peasant. If you look at my ancestors, my great-grandparents, 6 of them were from peasant families. 1 was from a mining stock, and others were tailors, but before that they were peasants. Because in the UK we have this class system. And when I went to the university in 1978, people like me didn't go to university. University was a place where the middle classes sent their children to learn English literature or to learn art history, or if they were maybe business people, they might want to learn economics or government, or if they were perhaps, if there's something wrong with your child, you might want them to do physics, some mathematics, something like that. So people like me, we weren't really meant to go to university, but there was this very small window where people who were exceptionally intelligent, which of course I am, and who were willing to do computer science, well, we do actually need some computer scientists, so let's take these people along. So when I got to university, I found everybody else who was doing computer science had the same kind of background as me. We were all factory workers or peasants, or our families had travelers or whatever, immigrants. But there was lots of people, and we all were at the bottom of the pile. Everybody else looked right down on us. And we raged against this. We treated each other as people. So when we would if I was to describe to you my friends, I would be saying, oh, well, you know, there was Nigel, and he's sort of got a hooky nose, and there was Roy, who had a moustache that never really ever achieved critical mass. And there was Kevin, who had big afro, and then there was Yulin, and he had another kind of hooky nose, but he was a bit more laid back. And then there was Gail, and she was a girl. And then there was Phil, and he was fat with glasses from Wales. So we were just, people had physical properties, but everyone was just a person. And we wanted that for the real world, because the real world was looking down badly on us, and we didn't like it at all. We wanted a better world where you didn't have all this rubbish. So we made one. Roy Trubshaw and I made this game, Mud, because we didn't like the real world. We wanted a better one. And so we made a better one. And from that one game, pretty well all today's MMOs directly descend. But that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't have come from a disadvantaged background. So although it looks like well, in fact, I am. I have got a whole load of advantages. I wouldn't. But the things were working against me at the time. That's why we didn't regard it as being, oh, you're white male. They weren't even factors. It was all to do with we're at the bottom of society, and we've got this one opportunity where we all had this hacker ethic. You can make the world better through computers. And in the UK today, we still got the same problem. When you hear about politicians or charity people or business people talking about, oh, we need to be more, we need more diversity, what they actually mean is we want more women, we want more people from ethnic minorities who went to Oxford or Cambridge. So they've got completely different, and sometimes they'll say things like, we'll social mobility, we do need some social mobility, we need some people who have got a poor background, and they will accept people from a poor background so long as they utterly betray their backgrounds. An example of this would be recent Brexit vote. See, artists are supposed to represent the views of the community that they're from. They're supposed to speak for the people against the people in power. And yet pretty well all our artists came out in favour of Remain. There's almost no artists in favour of Leave. Now, whatever you think, half the population said Leave, half the artists should have been saying Leave. But no, because the artists have been bought off by the upper class, therefore the artists, will lose our EU grants. They were on the side of Remain. So you can, the class system's like ingrained and it's self-defensive. So yeah, here I am. I'm the least diverse person here, and yet the only reason I'm here is because of a dimension which doesn't even affect anybody else on the panel. British class system.
Well, thank you for that. I don't think that was ranting. That was ranting at all. Perhaps we can. I'll give you a chance to respond to each other's comments. Maybe there's a thread you want to follow up on. But I also just point out that it seems that I like the fact that you're making the distinction between diversity and inclusion. And it seems that many of us feel like inclusiveness is a broader spectrum, a term that helps us get beyond thinking only about gender and ethnicity, which are the things that come up, and to be able to think more about those sorts of invisible audiences and the things that, it's almost impossible to think outside our own frames sometimes. And I think that's the challenge that we have. And I'm just wondering too, as I said, feel free to follow up, but thinking about the question then of talent and where and how where do we get our sort of our talent from in order to be inclusive in that way? Because as I said, we sort of represent, industry and academia, and those seem to be the avenues through which we get that in lots of ways. And I'd like to have you think more about that so that we can think about how those invisible people that we don't know to think of can help us think of them.
So this is something that I worked for a few years when our daughters were babies as a recruiter in the game industry. It seemed like a very good sort of hiatus job for me. And one of the things that I very quickly realized is in the available talent pool, you do that at that point. The college graduates that I was trying to place, you don't find the diversity there yet. And this is when I started becoming very active in Scouts. I was a Scout leader for 6 years, teaching girls how to program, and also looking younger, because there is, I don't know if this is a global phenomenon, but we see it in the United States. There is a stage where young people that are in grade school, kindergarten through 6 or so, are interested in everything. And then they hit a point, and it's just a few years after that where they start to sort of think, well, I'm not interested in that, and I'm not interested in that. And to me, a lot of one of my goals, particularly having been a recruiter and seen just what the job market really looks like, is to look younger and try to encourage people at a much earlier age to not turn away from these technical careers, these creative careers that can be, like I said, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I don't think I will ever stop. Tremendously fulfilling.
Well, just one thing I would add to that is that as I travel a lot, I visit a lot of places all over the world, speaking to developers or people or students or other people in the community who are very interested in game development, because it's really cool that game development has become this. It has become fairly democratized because the indie development or indie force, so to speak, and the free tools and all of that kind of thing. So you're seeing a lot of people out there who are pursuing game development because now it's something that's possible. It's almost as easy as going to an art store and buying canvas and brushes and painting. Doesn't mean your painting is going to be good. Just like, if you want to just kind of toy around with making a game, it doesn't mean it's going to be good from the start, but at least you've got the ability to do it. And so that's great. I mean, that means that there's access to the skills or there's access to the tools to make games. But one of the things that I often encounter as I go around is a lot of people, especially people who do not fit the quote typical demographic of game players, the white male kind of crowd that a lot of people expect. They just don't think that game development is even an option for them. I hear that all the time. I'll meet young girls or I meet young people of color in inner cities or wherever it might be. And they're like, well, I didn't know I can do that. Is that something I can do? It's like, of course you can do it. You can do anything, but it just, there's that perception there that there's like a barrier that is just, because part of it is because they don't see people like them in the industry as much. They're not as visible. And that's something of creates, a psychological barrier for them to pursue it.
Sorry, I'll pass it down in a second. I agree. It's a bit of a self-reinforcing cycle. I think it's starting to change. I think that since the audience is changing, you're getting more people that are interested in games because they grew up being involved in games, and I think that's brought a lot of new people. But even so, I'd say currently, I remember the last batch of hiring we did at BioWare. I'd say 90% of the applicants were all male, all white. I mean, of course, BioWare's in Canada as well, so the demographics are a little bit different. But even so, as a developer, I'm hearing more and more developers who are placing an emphasis on recognizing that who the applicant is, they bring a voice to the team, and that has inherent value the same as talent. I mean, it doesn't supersede it. If I'm hiring a writer, I want a good writer. But the talent, the perspective that they can bring to the team has value in and of itself, and that is worth bringing to the team. It will, in fact, make your end product better. So I think that gives some encouraging signs for the future.
Yeah, thank you. I think Jenny and Souvik also.
Okay. No, but I would go back to that with not seeing game development as a career choice if you're part of a kind of a group. I think this is really important. I think this is where we can actually do something. And as you said, I'm part of this Donna project that we try to reach out to young girls, but also like this, in a few weeks, we will also have a workshop in game design or game development workshop in a sort of kind of a suburb to Skövde, which is a kind of a small city, but you also have these people with very diverse backgrounds, and it's more of a multicultural place, and I think that is going to be so interesting, because I think also this group of people, they may not have considered this at all, maybe not even considered a career at the university. So just being active and doing things and showing that this actually can be them is really, really important. And I think that is something that we actually can do as well.
Yes.
And there are many initiatives. I'm thinking of this game programmer, what do you call it? No, girl game programming, blah, blah, something. Yeah, there's a lot of initiatives for that as well.
So I just wanted to add something from the Indian perspective, which links with Richard and with your questions on talent. I mean, I teach in a government university where the fees are 90 rupees per year, which translates to like 0.09 crore. I'm not sure even how much, probably nothing here. Right, so my students don't pay anything, literally, almost. And some of them are very rich, and some of them have to walk miles to access emails at cyber cafes. I don't know how many of you do that here. So, nowadays we insist on sending everything by email, so poor them. Now, so I'm looking at this demographic, and when I'm looking at people who are starting to learn or study video game design in India, they go to very rich, they go to very expensive private universities or private institutes, right? So we're looking at a kind of elitist, a kind of class-based kind of education, really. And my friend Shailesh, a talented game designer from India, is here. He probably will tell you more in his talk tomorrow. But I can see this big divide, really. And this, I'm not sure how one can address. But I'm just talking about pure questions of poverty, which will exclude a real kind of bunch of talented individuals who will get mathematics scholarships, physics, and whatever, and will probably study in other places in the US and wherever, but they will not go into game design. That's, well, yeah. So.
For the courses that I teach in the UK, we have very good ethnic makeup. It's as if it is a problem, then it's not one that manifests itself. There are some groups which have got a different cultural aspect to it. So we'll see a lot of people from Afro-Caribbean or African descent. We don't see many from Indian descent because the culture there tends to go into more professions such as law or proper programming, mainly because you can get paid more. So we don't have that kind of issue, or if we do, the barrier you have to jump isn't as high as it is for others. But where we do have an issue is in gender, in that the pool from which we fish has lots of male fish and not many female fish. And this is a problem that we have across all STEM subjects in the UK. So we're pretty good about multiculturalism. You know, I don't know what religion people have got or what ethnic background they've got. I don't care from the perspective of do I want to be in the same group as them. But the thing with gender is it really is an issue. I mean, even whether you're straight, gay, bi, or any of the other things that people now add on at the end, trans, that is not an issue for most of the people, because people who work in games industry tend to be very liberal. And the more liberal you are, because creative people tend to be more liberal, the more liberal you are, then the more you're likely to accept these things as well. It just makes sense. So, but it's the getting people to the stage. By the time they reach university, they've gone through a number of cuts, and each one of those cuts has said, okay, what do you want to do when you grow up? And if you're more mature, which most we're starting to get into. I don't want to say anything because that's going to make me misstep, as David says. But typically, women are going to mature earlier than men, and that means that while the men have still got stupid dreams, the women are thinking, actually, I could have a pretty decent career if I did this. Whereas the men are still thinking, oh, fair. So when they go to the university, oh, I'll do computer games, for most of it, it's actually bait. We're saying, come here, you like playing games. When they get there, haha, you actually like programming and you can go off and program something else where you'll be paid more for it. Go ahead. But some of them we do want with games. But with women, they've made their decisions. A number of times I've interviewed prospective students who are female, and what they want to do is not to make games, but to teach making games, which seems a bizarre thing, but but nevertheless. We see some of the things with we don't have enough female doctors, so let's recruit female doctors, and we recruit a whole bunch of female doctors. The women get onto the doctor programs, and then 25% of them want to be pediatricians, look after children. So we've suddenly got a shortage of people who want to do things like examining snot. I mean, things that aren't very pleasant. because we don't. The things that the guys think, oh well, I can't be. I'll just be the snot man, ear, nose, and throat. Whereas the women they've gone in with a goal and a plan in mind, and then found out that too many other people have it, and then they can't follow it up. So we do have that issue, and it's something that people need to be told. You can be somebody, whoever you are, but you should only tell them if you're not lying. If they actually can be. And that's why we need to make it that they can be game developers.
Jenny, I think you had a follow-up to that before.
Just a comment, really, because it's not only the women themselves that say that, well, I don't want to become a game developer. It's also their parents, it's student guidance, it's other people. So, and it's politicians, it's in the press saying that this is something that men do and boys do, and nothing that, this doesn't even concern you. So they haven't even, figured it out that they could be part of it. It's like, what could I become? So I've met so many female students that they had so many, obstacles before getting in here. So they are really like, yeah, I made it sort of. I managed to break my parents, basically.
Yeah, I think that's, we talk about that a lot, that it's not just enough to think in terms of having, more women in the chairs and in the industry, but it's changing the culture around that. And to change that culture means, digging deep to all of those sorts of
And we will actually talk about this tomorrow.
But Karin and Jenny have a panel tomorrow, and of course it's going to come up throughout. I'd like to see if we can. I also asked each of you again in an attempt to think about trying to make this both personal but also exemplary, so that we can think about what those moments of diversity and inclusion feel like in your own practice. That to give maybe a short example of when a light bulb went off, or there was something where you realized that it was an issue you had to think deeper about, or that you were pulled into a conflict, or that you resolved a conflict, whether it be positive or negative. And maybe we can just go around again. We can start with Kate and go through and see if you can just help us see what it means in actual practice to confront these with examples.
Sure. So one of the things that, you'll learn tomorrow when I give my talk, that I'm actually a geographer, and I've been working in the game industry for over 20 years, and what I do is culturalization work, and I help companies basically avoid making really serious political and cultural mistakes in their games, and I work on non-game stuff too. So I've got a lot of really cool examples along those lines, but for this purpose, I want to share someone else's example that I thought was really interesting. So last year, we did an IGD Leadership Summit in Seattle in September, and our keynote speaker was Christina Reed, and she was a producer on Big Hero 6. She worked at Disney. She was also the producer for the 2 short films, Paperman and Feast, and all 3 of those works won Oscars. And so she's a 3-time Oscar winner at Disney. Then she left Disney, and now she's back there with a whole different position, basically getting to write her own position now. But what's really interesting, she gave a talk on inclusion at our event last year, and the way she was describing how inclusion worked in their creative process was fantastic, because she attributed the success, which is the highest honor that you can attain in her field of getting an Oscar. She attributed that to the fact that they approached their creativity with a very clear goal of inclusion. So she said what they would do is that every single time they would have a meeting to discuss the ideas on a story point or a character design or something, they would invite absolutely everyone from the building to join. Whether they are the receptionist or the janitor or the catering people, the chef, whoever it might be, they wanted everybody in the room, and they were open to everyone's feedback. They made very clear rules that nobody's opinion is going to be discounted. Everyone's voice is going to be heard who wants to say something. And so that as they would go through that process, they would hear ideas that they never expected, compared to only gathering the senior writer and the senior artist in a room together with the producers to discuss the creative stuff. They invited all these different people of walks of life, different demographic backgrounds to hear and to see what was going on, in the building, even if they weren't part of the creative process. And she said that was just incredibly helpful for them to inform them, because as creative people, we can often get very much stuck in a rut in the way we think about things, or especially on a specific project. And so it's really important to kind of help, how do we open our minds? And that's the way that she did it, and that's the way they did it at Disney, and obviously it was very successful.
Thank you.
I guess when I worked on a game called Dragon Age 2, we had romances in Bioware games. That's sort of a big focus. And I remember we were coming off of the first game where we had 4 romances, and only 2 of which could be romanced by the same sex. And so we made all 4 of the romances in Dragon Age 2 bisexual. And we thought, okay, that's it, perfect fairness, right? And I remember after the game came out, the reaction to that taught us a lot. For instance, the fact that we'd made these characters bisexual not to be bisexual, but because that was convenient for the player, that they could be easily accessed, but that not to consider what that was saying about bisexuality as an identity, that its existence as a convenience for the player. We were saying things even though we didn't mean to say those things. It was one of the reasons we sort of broached it in the first place, because in the first game, because somebody who wanted a same-sex option only had 1 character they could romance, while everybody else had 2. That was saying something about what kind of audience we thought were playing our game, what we wanted to play our game, even though we didn't want to say that. So the reaction to Dragon Age 2 romances sort of started to teach us that sometimes you can think you're done, and then you realize you've got a lot more ground to cover and a lot more things to learn. That's a little bit trickier than you thought. That it's not just a matter of, okay, if we just add the characters and not think about how we're using them or what those characters are saying by being there, or how we're through how we're using them. If we're not considering that, we're going to perhaps make a lot more mistakes than we intended to, and so it requires a little bit more consideration and just that realization that it was a little trickier than we thought it was going to be. Sort of opened up this whole conversation.
Thank you.
So you talk about the sort of that watershed moment of when you realize there's an issue. I would say that was, again, I have been in the industry for a long time, but that was working at one of the first companies I worked at, and Friday night, I was the only woman on the team. They're like, hey, we're all going out. And I'm like, oh, that sounds great. I'd love to come with you guys. And they're like, yeah, we're going to the local strip club. And I'm like, okay, maybe I'll skip this one, but how about we all go out for lunch next week? And they're like, oh, that sounds great. Things have changed hugely since then. That's really my perspective on it. And these were perfectly nice guys. These were great people. They just didn't see that there was anybody other than them in the room. And I think for me, the big lesson of 25 years is we have come a long way. We still have a long way to go. But just the fact that we're here talking about this at a conference where this is the main theme, this is amazing. So that would be my perspective.
Thank you. Karin?
Yes, well, there's many examples, obviously, where you have this realization. I'm going to take maybe the worst one, which is a little bit negative. I'm sorry about that, but I think it's important to talk about as well. Also because I'm also an entrepreneur, like I'm a woman, I'm a game designer, and I'm an entrepreneur, and that's like an extra layer, which is also difficult to get into as a woman. And so my biggest realization is that in the situation where you meet game investors has been like the most difficult situations I've ever been to. And I think it's because the closer you get to money, I mean like the big money, the more evident the structures of power become. And so I think this is a very important issue because it's very hard to deal with, obviously, because we don't have the power over money always. But I think it's an important one. So that's my...
Yes, thank you.
I've also a long experience from working with games. I started in the game industry in 1996. I think I was the first woman in Sweden ever at a game company. But we were a small company, so the other guys were like me, like in person. We were the same kind of people, so I never really thought about it. I didn't even know that was an issue. And over time, we were almost half of the staff or something were female, so it was never an issue at that company. Until I realized that all women were paid much lower than all men. I could actually write a line where I could say that, okay, everyone above this line, these are my male colleagues, and everyone below are my female colleagues. And I think that really pissed me off. And also, of course, you've been mistaken for the receptionist. Like they call you and they would say, "Can I speak to someone who knows anything?" Well, you can talk, because we didn't have a receptionist. We were like 5 people in the company. Can I speak to someone who actually knows about this game and knows how this has been done? So I think that but it took some time before I really realized that it was an issue. Probably also when I started working as an educator and realized that why we don't have any female applicants, like why? And it's been taken so many years to change that. I mean, it's getting better, but it's still really, really bad. But it's so much better. So it's difficult to, I don't know. I have probably a lot of more examples, but that's mine.
Thank you.
So I'm going to share something which I feel, talking as an Indian player of games which have Indian themes and how they look to me. So I've got 2 light bulb moments. I'm going to, if I run out of time, just go for one. But this is a game where everybody knows Grand Theft Auto. I was reading this book called Jack by David Kushner on how Grand Theft Auto was made. And there is the Gouranga bonus, Gouranga. So you run over like 5 little orange characters in your car, and the screen says Gouranga, and you get this huge bonus, right? So now what happens is these 5 orange characters are members of ISKCON or Hare Krishnas, as they're generally called. And Gouranga means, like, I think, universal peace. It's actually the name of an Indian reformer whom they worship. Now, apparently the developer hated the Hare Krishnas because they would kind of accost him at the airport and ask him to be happy, right? So he kind of designed this kind of thing where you could run over them. And it's like, dude, there you go. Thanks, Gouranga. So he writes there, dude, I'm now killing Hare Krishnas. Right, and that gives you a bonus. And the later iterations of the game, you have Gouranga that opens up all the cheats to the game. So it becomes, but for me it's very problematic because I actually live very close to where these people have their headquarters, the Hare Krishnas, and they're, thinking of them, pixelated characters like that, and then kind of running, that's probably one thing, but even, it's just kind of, it's very jarring for me. The second example is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, where there is this pitched battle that goes on between the Russian and the American army in the Indian state of the Himachal Pradesh. India has the 2nd largest standing army. Where are they?
Yeah.
They're just not there. Right, so this is how kind of these games, this looks to me from, as a player from India.
Thank you.
Okay, so when I give my students assignments, one of the things I'll do is often I'll give them a setting. So I'll give them a game mechanic and they just have to reskin it. Or I'll give them a story plot and they have to create a skin of a story that fits it. And when I first started doing this, all the stories that I was getting were fantasy. And then come the financial crash, they suddenly switched to being about vampires. Then they switched to being about zombies. And nowadays they're about zombies in a post-apocalyptic world. Now that's most of them, but there are some that are always set in the university. So wherever it is, it's not set out in some jungle or in some imagined destroyed London, it's the university. All of those, I can pretty well guarantee, have been written by female students. Now, I mark these things anonymously. I have no idea who it is, but I do know that if I see one of those, that'll be a female student. Also, if I see one these days that's still fantasy, that'll be one of the students who's come from China, because they come over to a fantasy world and it's different for them. So you can tell from some students pretty well and they're all thinking the same thing. However, that's most of the students. Some students come up with absolutely off-the-wall, brilliant ideas. And you think, wow, that is incredible. I've given this assignment 10 years in a row, 10 years in a row, and this is the first person who's thought of that, and this person should be in the games industry. And I maybe get, maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 10, something like that, students would fit that. Now the thing is, what this tells me is a lot of people who do computer games degrees really shouldn't be doing computer games degrees. They've got no future in the industry. But some of them have. And those are the ones that we really want. So this is the diversity. People, they identify themselves among different dimensions. I clearly have got a chip on my shoulder about being working class. But other people would have chips on their shoulders about wearing socks. You're not a sock wearer. You just don't know what dimensions people have got that are important to them. So you can't say, in general, that just because somebody fits the mold, then they're going to produce the same answers. However, what I can say is that there are an awful lot of people that we don't reach because they don't even get onto the modules, because they don't apply to do this at the universities, that I'm not seeing their ideas. They've got things to say, but I never even get a chance to tell them people should be listening to you. My last time I taught one of the modules, one of my students, they got something 95%. I had to fight to not to give them 100, because I'm a sadist. But when I was in the class, I said, look, which one of you decided to set it? It was something to do with Don Quixote they'd done. And this girl puts her hand up, and I said, right, you, out of the class with me now. Took her out and said, this is the best I've ever seen. You've got to do this. You've got a talent. You really must work in the games industry. And what are you going to do? And she said, well, I'll probably just go back to America and maybe do a master's or something. No, you've got to work in the games industry. But for every one of her, how many of them, of people that are there who should be saying things that I'm not hearing? And that's what really opened my eyes to. It's not, if you gather a bunch of people who've all got the same backgrounds, some of them will have something new to say. But it's the ones whose background you don't get. Those are the ones that I'm missing. That's why I really think this is an important theme for this conference.
Thank you. I want to, the sort of the urgency of which you expressed that reminds me that, another thing I ask us to think about is to sort of, there needs to be, more of a call to action, call to arms of sorts, to really make the change happen. It's not something that we can be kind of passive or allow or accept, as I know that we're not, that things will eventually, normalize some kinds of action moments. So again, so that we can save at least just a quick few minutes for questions at the very end, but maybe in the form of a statement or a call to arms or something from each of you about what is the challenge that you can present both to the academy or to the game industry, something that you think is a solid move forward so that we can help motivate the change that we so want to see.
Okay, mine is pretty simple. If you run a company or you aspire to run a company, just do it, to borrow from Nike's corporate phrase. Like the example I gave, it's just a matter of will. You have the power to make it happen. You just have to make it important. And so make it important. Make it a priority when you're hiring. Make it a priority when you're putting your team together. Even now, if you're in an indie development group or if you're looking for other people, make it a priority. Try and just, you have to kind of move it up your level of priorities in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. And the other thing too is if you are applying to a large company or a medium-sized studio or whatever, ask the question about how diverse they are. Bring it up in the interview process and make sure that they're aware that candidates have this on their radar, because the more that they hear that from you, the more they'll be thinking, this sounds like it's important to people, and we need to be making sure that we too elevate this in terms of our priority. So basically, we really have to make sure we all do our part to expose the issue and make it, and I don't mean in a militant way necessarily, but I mean just bring it up and make sure it's part of the conversation.
David.
I guess my challenge to the industry is to figure out how they're going to protect their employees. A lot of we have women in the industry who are slowly getting harassed and driven out. I mean, even getting them onto the teams is one thing. It's another thing now worse than ever, to get them to stay, because it's become much more intimidating just for them to be in the industry and be visible. And I think while the companies they work for are probably for the most part horrified by what's going on and feel helpless, the point is that they're not helpless, but they sort of are standing by. And I mean, I don't want, the question is what can they do? But I mean, I think the challenge is they need to figure out how to do something, how to protect their employees, and how to, because I mean, the industry has been responsible for setting this tone. They are in fact responsible for much of the reaction that's out there in the community. So it is incumbent upon them to figure out how to address this problem and how to protect their own employees going forward, and because they're just not going to be able to build up the variety of people they need in their industry unless they do that.
Thank you.
I'm going to revert back to my Girl Scout troop leader. Find a child and encourage them. That we currently live in an age that I had no idea would ever happen 20 plus years ago, working in games where, oh my God, the Borland compiler, we don't have to write a compiler. We don't have to write our own engine. It is so easy to start, and it is so easy to find that this is entertaining and fulfilling work, but we have to start young. So if there's some child, a niece or nephew or a child of a friend that you could encourage, I would challenge you to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I seem to have chosen to put my entrepreneur hat on for this panel. I have many hats, but this is one of them. So I want to talk about funding. I want to have a diversity fund or funds specifically for games made by women or something around that area. I think that would be very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes. And I think also making an effort in all aspects. I think making an effort in recruiting women, but also, as you say, making them stay. Because, I mean, as an educator, we can do our part as much as we can, but then we cannot invite, for instance, women to our educations if we are then letting them out to a very bad working environment, when they're done with school. So, since I've started working with this, I realized that you have to be like everywhere. You try to influence politicians to sort of change the way we talk about games in society, and we talk to the game industry, trying to influence them to work more with gender equality and making safe environments, recruiting more women. And we talk to kids. Please, this is something for you. This is really interesting. Everyone can be this if you want to. And also, we have to work with gender equality, on our behalf in school. With the curriculum, with the environment, with the teachers, staff, everything. So, it never ends. When you start working with this, you can just go on and on. So we can do an effort, all of us.
So one thing I'm kind of going to talk about here is I don't see an easy route to kind of resolving these problems, but my main point is to kind of keep questioning stereotypes, and for that I think researching what you kind of write about or what you kind of represent is very important, and it's also important to respect the voices of those others that you don't normally see in your discourses, because they're out there and they might be buying your games as well. And yeah, well, there you go.
My call to arms would be honest. Universities and industry both need to be honest. Universities, after 2 weeks, I could go to my students, I could take 10 of them and say, you you could get a job in the game industry. You, not sure about you, you 6 are wasting your time. You have come here to study games. You are not going to get a games industry job ever. Because although we want diversity in the games industry, there is one area where we don't want diversity, where we want everybody to be the same, and that is creativity. So everybody who works in the games industry, we want to be creative. Now you can pull in people, as we were hearing earlier, from outside to give their opinions, and that makes game design and editing process. But everybody in the games industry better be creative. So if you're not creative, we're just taking your money and then you're going to go off and work in human resources. Likewise, I'd say to the games industry, you say that you want people with these skills to work for you. But you don't. You actually want people with those skills who are creative. You say, we need programmers, we'll do anything to get programmers except pay them what they could get in any other industry. Games programmers get paid about 2/3 of what they could get in programming washing machines. So it doesn't, you've got to be honest, because if you tell people you've got to have these skills to work in the game industry, then if you're a 15-year-old looking at a future career and you're thinking, I'm not going to get that job because I know I've got to learn all this programming, I might not be able to. So, but that's not what it is at all. You're smart. Smart people can program. Don't worry about it. You will learn. You've got to have a passion for it. You've got to know you want to make games, and that's why you will have made lots of games before you come. But saying you've got to have a certain skill set, otherwise you don't get through the door, that just shuts the door on people who could get the skill set but don't think they will. So that's what I'd say, just be honest.
Thank you. I think we're at the end a little bit over our time, but I'm still hoping that it's possible to ask maybe for a few questions before we go to lunch. I think there are people out there that I can't see. I see a hand up in the back for our panel.
This might come across as a little more personal question, but as a woman, as a bisexual woman, actually pretty terrible at straight acting as well. And the thing I have this buzz inside my head that I hear about all these women who get in the industry and they get pushed out, they get like this pretty intense amount of hatred chasing after them. And I kind of I have this buzz inside my head, like I need to have coping strategies. And I need to be somehow, I wonder about like, especially for Jenny and Karin, for example, and some other of you, like, what kind of strategies have you used to to handle those things?
So you're asking about specific coping strategies?
Yes.
For working in development?
Yes.
Well, one thing that I'll mention that might be an obvious one, but it shouldn't be understated is the community around you. I mean, most of us who deal with issues in this industry, whether it's dealing with the diversity inclusion type issues or whether it's just our own skill set in our daily jobs, it's about being connected with people around you. And I mean, it's like, I don't know a single person in this industry who has been successfully isolated themselves in a basement and have been successful. Maybe there's a few cases like that, and you get every creative field has its lone genius that eventually emerges, but that's a rarity. For most of us, we succeed, especially in the game industry, because games are collaboratively created art form. They're not something that are typically done in isolation. And so you really have to find people around you who can be a support network, whether it's support on your vocation, so like if you're a developer, finding other programmers who can help support you in doing that work, or if it's other people in a similar situation like you. I mean, this isn't a blatant plug for the IGDA, but I'm just saying one of the reasons the org was created over 20 years ago was for that purpose, to have special interest groups for writers and producers and game designers and all that, and have women in games SIG and all those other kind of groups so that people can support one another And that's really the way you cope with that more than anything else, is by sharing your experience with others. And if you have to, find a mentor who's been through it and kind of help you work through it.
Yes, thank you. I think finding your community.
I was just going to echo that because you touched it at the end. Find a mentor, because a lot of us, there's a lot of us who have been in this industry for a long time, and we've probably dealt with some of the issues you have.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I think there's, sorry, it's difficult to see, but maybe way in the back somebody's waving.
Hey, when I think of inclusive, I mostly think of disabled people or disabilities, but I've never seen a game mention this. Do you think it's another issue to address this topic?
Did you hear that? I'm sorry, it's hard for us to hear the question, I think.
Compared to gender equality or ethnics, do you think addressing disabilities is...
Abilities.
Disabilities.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's I think an important question. Another invisible audience that's increasingly becoming more visible, and sensitivity to it, but I'm wondering where we are.
I don't want to monopolize the mic here. There is some great efforts out there. I mean, there's like Able Gamers, if you've heard about that organization. They're mainly based in the US, but Able Gamers is focused specifically on helping gamers who are who deal with different forms of disability, mainly physical disability, but in some cases mental disability as well. And so Able Gamers, you might want to look them up, because they've got a lot of strategies and a lot of initiatives that they're doing to basically help game designers and the game industry be better aware what their needs are. There's also groups like, Able Gamers is the main one. Like, we have our accessibility special interest group in the IGDA, which is mainly focused on helping game developers not only design for accessibility, but also for developers who have their own disabilities. How do they access the tools and use things like Unity and Unreal and all that if the software packages are not designed well to help people with disability? So there's definitely efforts out there that are focusing on that. It's just, you're right, it's another area, yet another aspect of the gaming population that this industry still has to address in a better way. It has definitely improved, I would say, over the last decade, but there's still a long way to go. And especially as we're getting into new technologies like VR, that's introducing a whole nother level of, how do you build in accessibility in VR? I mean, there's actually some functions of VR that are really good, but there's other aspects that are not considered yet, so.
Souvik, I think our last comment.
I just wanted to add that there are, I'm aware of quite a bit of work being done on games with disabilities, and I did my PhD in Nottingham Trent, where they have a conference on games for disabilities every year, and there is a working group which works on kind of using game technology for disabilities. I was just telling Richard about, I remember I saw how the Wiimote was being used as a tool for the visually challenged to negotiate, So there is quite a bit of work going on, and yeah, well, that's just.
And I think tomorrow, two of our colleagues will also present a game that we created here in University of Skövde for visually impaired people, but they're also so it's a graphical game. So the aim is to work inclusively, to allow visually impaired people play with the same, with equal opportunities and equal sort of ground as other players, so they can share the experience. So it's not about adding, for instance, a voice over something like a built-in aid, but rather to include these sort of functions in the game, in the design, so that everyone experiences it, independently of whether you have a disability or not. So I think they will speak tomorrow.
Yes.
Yeah. Henrik and Per Anders will talk about frequency missing.
Okay, I'm afraid that I don't want to keep more time over your lunch hours. I'm say just something quickly about the lunch for those of you who weren't here earlier. The lunch will be served out on the, I think, one of the balconies out here, but also you can go inside the O'Leary's restaurant pub for lunch as well. And then we'll meet back for the program after that. But thank you very much to our panel, and thank you very much to those of you